The Hollow Ones Part 1, The Vanishing Town. It started with a map. Michael Harper was driving across the country, following a carefully planned route, when he noticed a town that wasn't supposed to be there. It was marked as Ravens Hollow, a small dot between highways, though he was certain it hadn't been on his GPS before. A mistake, he thought. A glitch in the system. And yet, something about the name pulled at him. By the time he saw the turnoff, he had already made up his mind. Curiosity was a dangerous thing, but he had always been a man who followed it. The road to Ravens Hollow was shrouded in fog, the trees on either side twisted in unnatural ways, their branches stretching toward his car like skeletal fingers. His radio crackled with static as he neared the town's entrance. Then, without warning, the fog began to shift, swirling as if alive. Shapes emerged, faint at first, like shadows bleeding into existence until, suddenly, the town materialized all at once. The air around him felt heavier, dense with something unseen, something ancient. And yet, there it was, Ravens Hollow, standing silent, waiting. And the town appeared. It was wrong. The streets were lined with old-fashioned lampposts, but the houses looked abandoned and untouched at the same time. Storefronts stood with signs that read "Open," yet no one walked the sidewalks. The air smelled stale, as if time had stopped here long ago. Michael parked on the main street, stepping out into the eerie silence. His boots echoed as he walked toward what looked like a diner. The "Welcome to Ravens Hollow" sign above the door was covered in dust, but underneath it, someone had scratched into the wood, "Don't look at them." His stomach twisted. Then the bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. And everything changed. Part 2, The Silent Watchers. Inside the diner, the atmosphere felt thicker, like the air had weight. The smell of coffee lingered, though the cups on the counter were coated in dust. Every stool at the bar was occupied by people who didn't move. Michael's breath hitched. The patrons sat perfectly still, their hands resting on tables, their heads slightly tilted down as if frozen mid-action. Their clothes were old, decades out of fashion, but what unnerved him most was their faces. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, their mouths slightly open, as if whispering without making a sound. A cold sensation crept up his spine. Then he saw the waitress. She stood behind the counter, staring at him. Unlike the others, she moved, but her expression was vacant, hollow. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Michael swallowed hard. "What is this place?" The waitress glanced toward the unmoving patrons, her fingers trembling as she reached for something under the counter. A scrap of paper. She slid it toward him. It was a torn-out page from an old book. The words were faded, but one sentence stood out: "The Hollow Ones do not like to be seen." Then, behind him a chair scraped. Michael turned. One of the patrons had moved. And it was staring at him. Part 3, The Hollow Awakening. Michael's pulse quickened. The figure's head, which had been bowed just moments ago, was now lifted. Its eyes were entirely black, like deep wells of emptiness, and its mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. The diner seemed to close in on him. The lights flickered, and suddenly, all of the patrons moved. Their heads turned in unison, their lips moving without making a sound. The whispers, faint, layered voices, grew louder, overlapping, building into a chorus of something inhuman. The waitress grabbed his wrist. Her grip was cold, desperate. "You have to leave," she whispered. "They've seen you." Michael wrenched his arm away. "Who are they?" She shook her head. "Not who. What?" A shadow shifted across the diner floor, something large. Michael turned toward the entrance. The front door had vanished. Part 4, The Forgotten Ones. A slow, heavy thud echoed through the building. A sound of something massive moving above them. The Hollow Ones feed on those who see them, the waitress said quickly. "They keep the town alive by taking from those who enter." Michael's stomach lurched. He glanced at the black-eyed figures. Their bodies were changing, stretching, distorting. Limbs elongated unnaturally, their skin paling to something almost waxen. A second thud sounded. Then another. Footsteps. From the ceiling. Michael could barely breathe. "How do I leave?" The waitress swallowed. "You don't." The ceiling bulged downward. Something huge shifted above them. The lights shattered. Darkness consumed the diner. Then, Michael felt something breathing against his ear. A whisper, right beside him. "You belong to us now." Part 5, The Hollow Ones Take What They Want. Michael stumbled backward, his body moving on instinct. He couldn't see. The whispers grew louder, like voices speaking through cracked radio waves. The air felt thick, suffocating. Something cold touched his shoulder. Then light flooded the diner. The waitress was gone. The patrons were gone. The hollow ones were everywhere. They filled the room, hundreds of them, shifting like shadows made flesh. Some hung from the ceiling, their necks craned in impossible angles. Others stood mere inches from him, grinning. Michael bolted toward the only thing he could see, a door at the back of the diner. He crashed through it and into an alleyway. The town was different now, warped. The buildings were twisting, curling like old paper. The sky was wrong, a swirling black void with no stars. And then, he saw them. The hollow ones stood along the street, motionless, watching him. Their heads tilted slightly, their empty black eyes reflecting nothing. Some of them twitched, their movements sharp and unnatural, as if adjusting to his presence. Their mouths stretched open, silent, grinning, waiting. The ground beneath him shifted. His feet were sinking. Hands, dozens of them, burst from the pavement, clawing at his legs. He screamed, thrashing, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank. The hollow one stepped closer. Whispering. Laughing. Then everything went dark. Epilogue. Welcome to Raven's Hollow. Michael opened his eyes. His vision blurred as shapes reassembled around him, like reality stitching itself back together. He blinked. The low hum of fluorescent lights flickered above. The air smelled of old coffee and something stale, something wrong. He was sitting in the diner. The same diner. The cup of coffee before him was coated in dust, untouched just as it had been before. But something was different. The edges of the world felt thinner, stretched, like a reflection in a warped mirror. Across the counter, the waitress stared at him. Her face was the same. But her eyes were wrong. Behind her, the bell above the door jingled. A stranger stepped inside. And everything began again. A cup of black coffee in front of him. Dust covered. Untouched. His hands rested on the table. His body frozen, paralyzed. He tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't move. Across the counter, the waitress stared at him. Behind her, a stranger walked through the front door. The bell jingled. And everything began again.